Welcome to yet another episode of the Republic Dialogue. I'm here in studio with Mr. Bryan Ramaphane, who is an attorney with a strong commitment to social justice, being the founder of Mabogodinku Trust, actively working on policy, evaluation, and legal education. He is a man known in advocacy initiatives, and he has dedicated a significant time to pro bono work, assisting survivors of GBV and other marginalized groups in navigating the justice system. Not only being a law degree holder, he is also pursuing a master's degree in politics and international relations. Mr. Bryan, good afternoon, sir.
Thank you very, very much for inviting me to this discourse. Yes.
Okay. Two quick fire questions, eh? Does the penal code define gender-based violence?
Thank you very much. The penal code does not define gender-based violence.
Yes.
But throughout this interview, we will probe the framework that we have insofar as the Domestic Violence Act is concerned, the penal code is concerned, and even the Constitution of Botswana.
All right. Yes. And in the two quick fire questions, does the Domestic Violence Act define gender-based violence?
It doesn't define gender-based violence, but it defines what a domestic violence is.
Yes.
A quick perusal of the Act, one would argue that it was made for purposes of preventing domestic violence within a homestead, be it people who are married or people who are in a relationship or a perceived relationship.
Okay, so in that, can we argue to say gender-based violence does exist in law?
In essence, there is no legislation that deals with gender-based violence, but there's a legislation that deals with domestic violence. So now what one can argue is that we have overall law that deals with violence, which is the penal code, that deals with assault and other incidental or other crimes that are found in the penal code.
Okay. I think given the fact that you are going to be speaking on the topic of law and gender-based violence, and also given the background that you have in law, it is to say you are going to do a lot of legal jargon, eh?
I appreciate what you are saying, but I'll try by all means to break it down for the viewers at home, if possible for us to use Setswana, gore ba leka go tlhaloganya gore dikgang tsa teng re ka di tsayang kana di ntse yang.
Alright. Re ke lebogela gore bo o kgonne go bua jalo ebile wa e baya jalo. I'll get right into it, right? Gongwe yaanong ke botse re tsene mo legato la rena la letsatsi la gompieno re bua gone gore what does the law protect against? Re ntse o ntse o gakarabo jalo bua ka the penal code, bua ka the Domestic Violence Act, right? Interpretation ano e be nna gone gore interpretation ke eng jaanong gore molao sente o sireletsege.
Molao o leka go protect against violence.
Yes.
If you look at the penal code, section 244, section 255, it deals with violence. It deals with the punishments for a violent person. But there's another law or another legislation it deals with domestic violence. Ke violence ya mo malapeng kana ya batho ba mo di relationshiping. That's a different law that we'll deal with.
Okay. Yes. So that is to say, molao wa go sireletsa ha re bua ka violence, regardless of the nature of your race, your culture, your gender.
Yes. Nkare molao o teng o comprehensive wa sireletsa. The question e ke nna ke botsa batho ke gore batho bone ke batho ba bantseng jang? Ke batho ba ile gore ba obamela molao. La ha molao le teng hong ke batho ba ile gore are they violent in nature? Ke batho ba bantseng yang. So swantse re mo interviewing ya tsetseong re leka go tlhaloganya the nature of a Motswana gore ke motho o ntseng yang ebile le gore melao e le ha ile teng a ke batho ba ile gore ba tla nna ba e roba kgapetsa.
Re to bua thata ka violence ka no setswa go bua, and nako tse dintse ha re bua ka violence also speak about assault, right? So I want to know what constitutes assault in law.
Yes. Assault can be in many forms. Firstly, you can cause bodily harm towards someone. For example, if you beat someone to an extent, it can constitute an assault. So it depends on the veracity rather of it. So even the penal code, just assault, then assault occasioning bodily harm.
Okay, so does verbal abuse then also amount to assault? So does verbal abuse and insult amount to assault?
Yes, it amounts to assault. For example, if you look at the Domestic Violence Act, it specifically deals with different categories of domestic violence. And one of the examples that they give in the act is mental assault or intimidation, or even assault to an extent of
One other question that I want us to get into before we dive deep into the conversation and maybe try and make a linkage with issues of gender-based violence is the threat to commit an act. Gantsi mo Botswana ke tsa gongwe le bile wa itse gore there is that threat to kill, right?
Yeah.
So is a threat to commit an act of violence in itself? Besides it being as gross as saying I'd like to kill you, I'd want to kill you, gongwe ke batla go commit something that may seem to be minor compared to the threat that killing is. Does it amount to an act of violence, that one?
Yes, it does. In fact, the law does quantify it as such.
Yes.
Because there is a certain extent where le gore motho o kgone go isiwa o itha kwa makhuteng gote motho na re tsemengwa amrare ke ta go bola mo bitswang gote threat to kill.
Yes.
Normally the issue really becomes the mental capacity of whether or not someone really meant gore a ke ta go bola and to what extent gore motho na ra gore ke ta go bola jang. So normally the arguments or the nuances tsa go court gonna go bua gone kganyo kana di lawyer di nganga gore a me a motho na a go ra gore ke a go bola a bua ba maruri kana na ra gore ke a go bola sa bui ba maruri, but Batswana bone ba gone go dirisa hela gore ke ta go bola o sa itse ra o bua ba maruri kana ha bui ba maruri. So there's always a thin line or a blurry line mo di kganyeng tsa teng.
Okay, given the factors that you need to consider ka yone threat to kill, gongwe ha yaanong ke threatena gongwe go rape go thubetsa, do these factors also are they taken into consideration gore a me ke bua ke thwahetse kana go na le different way to go about that one?
Yes, I think that one would go straight into structural issues. Remember, case high reportiwa ko police and we gather evidence. There's someone who gather evidence and before it actually goes to court. So normally o tshwantse ro lemoga gore a me as at the time ma police bone ba are they capacitated to understand gore go te motho o na re o ta bola motho kana o ta ripa motho? Do they take it further for it to even go to the extent of going to court? Because it is only at court that is going to be interrogated. Ke gone te bere lebella yone the mental part gore a me no raya. That is where we are going to test even the evidence itself. How re ke ta go ripa kana ke ta go bola. But in law, yes, it does exist. The question now becomes the practicability of it.
Okay.
Yes.
I think we tried to speak about violence and the interpretation that law has on violence. And then maybe what are my rights in reference to violence and the Constitution? Do I have certain rights that I need to enjoy?
Yes. Everyone has the fundamental rights, the rights to privacy. If someone adds your right to privacy, or your right of being, right? So how someone can visit assault upon you, those rights exist. Like I keep on saying or asking, the question becomes whether or not we have, or rather the courts implement those rights, insofar as implementation is concerned. How, or the system, how ole Tshepiso re ke biditswe ke motho ko block 6 o bo reporter, to what extent is that matter isiwe ko lokhoteng a ona itsholola kore there are a lot of nuances tse le re tebe di nothing after case e reportiwa. But insofar as the rights, the framework in thing, the issue really becomes whether or not gona le practicable ways of dealing with it.
Okay.
Yes.
I think that one is sorted. When is violence allowed in society? How we araba o le ke go bua ka rona re le the society members and
Yes.
maybe how the society would then who live with the institutions. You know, that's violence. I want to believe that would be violence, right?
Yes.
Then when is violence allowed in the society? Take into consideration us as societies and societies with institutions.
Yes, and normally if you look at the law or you look at the defenses that someone would have in law, you'd argue that, or there are obviously to a certain extent where the police would be allowed to use a certain extent of violence, maybe to arrest someone who's refusing an arrest. But remember, the violence or that act of force must be used reasonably, or when it's or an act of self-defense. To a certain extent, you can be allowed to use violence. Violence in the society that I think has been condoned. For example, growing up, bana ba bezwa, and that is violence on its own. Just that we don't categorize it as such.
Okay.
Yes.
Growing up, ko lapeng, gongwe motsadi o kgona go nthara ke tla go betsa. I did something, and what comes next isn't ikopa maitshwarelo ka nsa dire yalo. Gota if you do this again ke tla go betsa ka neng. Can we categorize this as a medium of assault, or can it lead to assault? Ke tla go betsa.
Yes. Remember in her conversation the mental capacity or the mental so normally as a society we struggle because to what extent so on the receiving end I may interpret it as violence or as assault, but the person who say it may interpret it in anyhow. For example, I may create a nuanced argument or pose a question. We are going to have different conversations from different people and different answers. Some are going to say, but Bazadi are allowed to say that in jest to discipline their children. Some are going to say, but they say that and continue to beat their children. Some are going to say, they end up turning into violent children.
Okay. In an event where I've assaulted someone, right? What defenses do I have? Is a kanya go leka go rotwetsa gone gore gongwe re commit violence ka re commit assault, but maybe just to appreciate the full context of the law on both parties. Gone gore if I've committed a violent act, I've assaulted someone, what defenses do I have? And kana ha ke re ke commitile violence kana assault, kra ibile in cases where there is that self defense, right? Kana gongwe one ke someone is provoking me and I'm retaliating some sort. So what defenses do I have in that?
Yes, and you have asked me a question and answered itself. There are different defenses. Sometimes you can say it was necessary for me to take that act. Sometimes you can say I was provoked for me to act that way, or I was in self-defense. But the line, where we draw the line is when now evidence is tendered. To what extent were you allowed to use that violence? For example, mpanga when also a gun or a machine gun. Some may argue that you have to fire a warning shot before you actually kill the person or shoot the person, or you have to shoot them on the foot. So now it depends on to what extent are you allowed to use that violence. There are some instances where you can be held to be violent when the court deems you to have used unnecessary force in the circumstances.
There must be quite a lot of fine lines when we speak to the law.
Yes.
Oh, there really is. Taribue ka mob justice. Mob justice, when legodu ke leo ne le utswa ha phase 4, badni ba phase 4 be ba motshwara ba mmetsa. In law, what is that? Do we categorize it as violence? And o tebeng a biditswe o dileng gone gongwe o bitswa go tekele godu o na le defense ene.
Yes, I want to give you an example, right?
Yes.
Someone goes to your house and steals a decoder, and you say le godu kileo, right? How has our le godu kileo ebe mongwe le mongwe a malola a tshwere machete. mo go tshware machete le ene o tshwere okapi, but he's trying to protect himself and he stabs one of you, that can be seen as an act of self-defense. So the presumption in law is that everyone is presumed innocent until found guilty. So
Yes.
it means we have to go through the processes of court. That is investigation, court, you are tried. To say the state must bring a case against you, you are allowed to cross-examine those witnesses, the state on. Then the decision of the court is made. Mob justice on its own, you are sentenced before you even go to court. So one would argue that on its own is violence because there's no presumption of innocence.
Okay. So
One would argue even batho ba ba nang le ba ba leng mo, or by law they've been labeled by the society as maybe thieves, they still enjoy those rights. Even within the mob justice itself, they still have, to a larger extent, rights that they enjoy.
okay, kana yaanong I think re ta re bua thata ka di-nuances ke tla ko utlwa o dirisa lehoko le letona le, and speaking about the fine line in court, right? So make me understand le motswana o dibileng ko gae gona gore then what sort of evidence is required to mount a case of assault and or violence to be successful in court? Ke tlhokana le bosupi ba go tshwana le.
Yes. And what we also have to understand is that the role of prosecuting lies on the state. As a complainant, you go to the nearest police station. The police will gather evidence. Then a docket is transferred. Then you prosecute. The state must prove beyond reasonable doubt, which is a higher standard as compared, for example, in civil cases, where it's on the balance of probabilities. It must prove that you were there, you committed the act, and you had the mental capacity to commit that act.
Okay. Are ka bonya and tread back a little, right? The state has to, or is forced to bring the large part of the evidence.
Not the large part, all the evidence.
All the evidence.
Yes. Remember, we are working against the presumption of innocence.
Okay.
So you are innocent until the state provides enough evidence for the court to find you guilty.
All right.
Yes.
I'm going to want to link this question to maybe gender-based violence, because to take it to particularly going through someone's private property, right? Private property, maybe you entering my home and you may be being a thief, and then there's that one you are going through my phone and or my private messages, right? So in terms of maybe gender-based violence, particularly to the second question, going through someone's phone, right? Do you amount that as an act of a violence?
It's an arguable case. One would argue that as a person, maybe you would have a right to privacy to your phone. Then if you are going through someone's phone, it would amount to an infringement of that right. So that's I would say that. Yes.
Okay. O le go ntlhalosetsa gape ke molao.
Yes.
Ke molao o ka go timetsa. Go hala khantene re bua gona gore the penal code does not define gender-based violence, right?
Yes.
And then the domestic violence law define gender-based violence.
Yes.
And in the situation where a partner is going through another partner's phone, we don't cite it as gender-based violence, but violence.
Remember, I would want us to track back to what I said about definition of domestic violence.
Yes.
So a relationship between two people who are in a relationship or a perceived relationship, that may be domestic, a domestic relationship,
Yes.
but is not, or a domestic violence, but is not gender-based violence. Let's give an example, right? If you look at the Domestic Violence Act, it has a list of people that fall within the confines of what a domestic relationship is. People who are married, who stay in the same residence, who are in a relationship, who are relatives. What now if a man kills someone that does not fall within the confines of that act? You see, it's not domestic.
Yes.
It's not defined according to the domestic relationship insofar as the act is concerned. Which means we now look at the primary law, which is the penal code, that deals with violence, that deals with other crimes that are found in the penal code.
Okay.
That is why when now the president, there's a very interesting argument I had with someone that gender-based violence does not exist in law. It's a different arguments where everyone can have different pros and cons to it, or for and against.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Okay.
But looking at the framework, you see, I gave an example of something that, or an example of where it doesn't fall within the act. Yes.
Okay. So anong gongwe re tswa pele ho ha re bua nthata ka molao re itebaganya yone violence. What remedies do I have? Ha ke itse gone gore nya mme go ha ke leng teng ha. Violence e ka re ke tata ke nna mo seemo se leng gore I'm going to be violated, I'm going to be assaulted. Ke ikuela kae ebile ha ke sena go ikuela go iragalang?
Yes. Firstly, if there's any threat, or you are going to be violated, is to report to the police, and they will take up the case and investigate and take the matter to court. If it's, for example, if it falls within the confines of a domestic relationship, according to the Domestic Violence Act, then there are other remedies that are available in that act. If you look at, I think Section 4, if not 7, it deals with interim orders. It deals with orders that you can seek, then you can be granted. For example, if someone is stalking you, your ex-boyfriend is stalking, your ex-girlfriend is stalking you, you can use that act and make an application for a restraining order. Yes.
O ta intshwarela gongwe ke go botse tuo tse ke tuo tse leng gore batswana ba di appreciate ba di itse ba nang le kitso ka tsone.
I think one of the things se nka se buang ke gore ba di itse ba di tlhaloganya, mathata ke gore ha gona enough public education on them to say what are the remedies available to me if I'm assaulted in a domestic relationship. Gape batswana ba kgone gore kana most of these things tse dingwe di tlhokana le di lawyer. The lawyer are expensive and this and that. So there's a different conversation around that as well.
And maybe our institutional forces are they empowered enough to get on with this issue ya go bata yone evidence ke ra gone gore ha ke tsena ha le ke bua ka kganye a ke kganye potlakelwang kana these some of the cases that get lost in many other administrative duties, you know, your lack of resources sometimes on those lines. Maybe in your experience in the law field, how is it?
Yes, I think obviously after I think 2008, domestic violence was identified as a problematic issue in the society. So we have the police desk that dealt with that to say ha motho a bua gore wa tshwenywa kana o irwa yang ba rago ga gore ba kgone gore ba go thusa. There is also a lot of advocacy groups tse le gore di a thusa batho ba eleng gore they come with those issues.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'd also want to believe I might enjoy the same benefits as maybe me being a victim of violence. I might enjoy the same benefits that someone who's a soon-to-be victim of violence might enjoy. Ke ra tsone tsa go ba sepodisi le report the case and then they take it up with you. So those are the remedies that have been in place for me as a victim of violence.
Yes. Remember earlier I had said for example, threat to kill, where you say, I'm about to be violated, it becomes difficult because the person who gets or gathers information about that must be very skilled to discern that this person is about to be violated and these are the orders, or this is how I need to help the person, right? So normally some are dismissed as just domestic cases. To say, to a certain extent, le rona batswana re swantse re blame ha go dilwa ka di issues tse ka gore tebe go tenya ba le ba lwetse ruri tota. So you are going to dismiss it as go lwela ruri, not deal with the issue.
So violence then would be a subject that would need all of us at the table. Let
Yes.
us not put everything onto the institution that is maybe your police services.
Yes, we need to probe the society. We need to dissect. We need to understand ourselves as an individual. What type of person are you? Gore violence ga e tehela in the form of in the physical. Go na le batho ba ile gore ga ba itse go buisa batho sentle, batho ba ile gore ba tshele. It can amount to violence. So those are the things that we need to understand. What type of society are we when you grow up? O gola le batho ba bantseng yang. Remember, batho ba ile gore ba bangwe ba go teng ba bola batho mo society. Ba bangwe ke batho ba ile gore wa ba itse o godile le bone bang. Mme from a young age bo ba kile ba supa di tendency dingwe tse ile gore gongwe di teng ho tse ile gore that we need to address. Mathata a nna ile gore re togela bolwetse bo kekela re sa deal le jone gore ngwana o godisiwa yang. How do you raise a boy child, for example? Gore how does a boy child view a relationship? To what extent does a boy child feel entitled to a girl child?
So these psychological issues that can lead to these forms of violence.
Yes.
Okay. And re ntse re bua re le ka go dissect what our institutions can do or are doing in terms of issues of gathering evidence and all that. When it comes to then maybe paying the price, if I may, the punishment that comes for someone who has been violent to the next person. What is the punishment for violence?
Yes, the punishments may vary. Sometimes you hear someone say, "Mutolo wirleana me usevile only maybe 2 or 3 months." Remember, court process. You are tried and you are convicted. Then after that, you sentence, which means there are mitigating factors. Kana tse lo gore wa ipobola as an accused person. Gona le do tse dingwe tse lo gore go ka ipobola ka tsone tse lo gore rona mo society ra bo re sa ditse. Ha o ipobola ha ile gore minimum wa teng ke 2 years, maximum ke 10 years. O gona ithela motho a hilwe 3 years. So the gona le process e le gore e teng ya sentencing e le gore re tshwantse re appreciate.
Okay, so maybe looking at the figures that we have currently, gantsi e tene re ga go nna le dilo tse di ragalang dipalong tse di oketsega e be go tla ga matsemelao increase your charges re oketse the jail sentence. Is this a conversation that we should be having gone gore we should look into making our laws more strict and tight kana in yone education a kono se go bua sensitizing re ikagere le batswana?
The death penalty has existed since when? We are still having a lot of numbers. So, obviously, there is an issue that we are not dealing with. There's a psychological issue that we are not dealing with. There's a systematic issue that we are not dealing with. We are not dealing with the real issue, that is how to raise a boy child.
So, I think is the law sufficient? Do you think the law is sufficient in this current point in time?
Yes, I would say the law is sufficient. The law exists as a framework to govern humans. The humans must govern themselves, and they must interrogate and innovate and create and recreate a society that they want. We would have a framework that says, do not steal, right? But if the society inherently they will find a way around the law, do not steal.
Okay. The law at this current point in time. Bryan, you are an attorney, right? Constitutional. I don't know when the penal code was established or set, Domestic Violence Act. So taking into consideration the argument that our constitution is that old, can't we then also borrow that argument and bring it to the penal code and say maybe our penal code is also old in terms of adjusting to any sentencing? Unless I got it wrong and sentencing doesn't, the penal code doesn't, give some form of recommendation. Kana oka set sentence on what grounds? Kana the limits, something along those lines.
Yes. What the penal code does, it prescribes, right, to say, if you do this, you are guilty of, then it recommends that the minimum and maximum you get. Then the court will analyze and give what a sentence in its view would be sufficient for that crime. So my answer to that would be, obviously we need a study. Most of these laws were invented kana ko eleng gore we didn't have laws, so ne di tsewa di tswa go Msadinyana kana di tswa go Cape Town di ta di bewa. So we now need our laws, do our study ka di laws tse eleng gore they reflect the current society. What does the current society say about these things? For example, if you look at the Domestic Violence Act, it prescribes, it says that a person can be charged a maximum of 5,000 and a maximum of 2 years in prison. The question will be whether or not that is sufficient for that crime. And the study will then inform us to say, oh, okay, renewally domestic violence cases dilikana from this until this. The study recommends this, and that.
Okay. Speaking of studies, do you in your profession make some out of these studies? You know, say for example, in your firm, the case about, I don't know, 300 cases, people are filing for they are grieving from assault and violence. As a legal expert, do you make research around these things and help, you know, any other civil organizations, government, any other stakeholders in trying to combat these issues of violence and yes?
Yes, like I had said earlier, I had Mabohoding Trust that does one of the things that we do is to provide pro bono work. When you provide pro bono work, firstly you research around the area and you recommend. Then secondly you go to court to say, I've went to court, this is what I've experienced. One of the things that I had a discussion or a discourse with a friend of mine. I was saying, someone can challenge a restraining order at court by hiring a lawyer, and a lawyer can raise points of law, and that restraining order application can be thrown out on that technicality. So now we have not dealt with the merits of the case because there's that technicality. So how best can we have access to the court? You see, so those are the questions that we need to ask.
Okay. Ne re bua hale ka molao ke batla re gongwe re boele nyana ha morago go lebise that recent motion ne bua ka di peace desk at police stations. Yes. Maybe share with us, what do you think these would have would they have aided in any way possible the reduction of violence committed in domestic and or romantic relationships?
Yes. Remember, firstly, I want us to, like I said, I want us to probe these issues. Firstly, let's look at the intention of the motion, right? Was it used or politicized? To what extent was it politicized? That's number one. Number two, did it address the rudimentary issues, or did it attend to the systematic issues that we have? I don't think it did. For example, if we are saying domestic violence or violence, gender-based violence is a systematic issue, it deals with the psyche of a man, right? A man would avoid a police desk one way or another. For example, if you say we have a police desk that collects information and this person can be given a protection order, a person with money can still fight that protection order with a lawyer, a good lawyer, right, and file points of law to say that that protection order is incompetent in law or this and that. The question now is, are we capacitated? The person who receives the complaint at the police desk, is he or she capacitated to deal with or educated to deal with gender-based issues, right? Do we have a magistrate or a judge who's capacitated to deal with those issues? Is the system itself, is it a system that is patriarchal? Those are the questions that I think we need to discuss. Are we, Botswana, a violent nation? Those are the issues that we discuss. And in interrogation of issues, it doesn't mean that we have to attack each other or anything. We just have to analyze ourselves as we are and recreate the society that we want.
Okay. Kana hani ke bua ka the peace deck, that is a motion that went through Parliament. I don't know. Give us an opinion here, Mr. Bryan. Gona gore, should we then maybe see something that comes up to define maybe a gender-based violence act kana mo penal code go tsengwa tsetlana nngwe kana gona go domestic violence act that is somewhat targeted to the gender-based violence?
Yes. First solution, grassroots education. Go and teach the boy child how to behave from a younger age to remove the entitlement, right? Second solution will be to empower the courts. Let them be resourced. Let the magistrate be in a capacity to deal with these issues. Then thirdly would be to educate, civic advocacy. These are the platforms where we need to interrogate. And there's nothing wrong with disagreeing in principle. But the question and the issue that I've always had is we don't really interrogate these issues to say, okay, if we say, we give an example with the Minister of Youth and Gender, we have to look at his ministry or her ministry to say, what is the role of a minister in combating those issues? To what extent can a minister help us in these issues? Then provide recommendations to her, not to attack her. To say, oh, by the way, I think you are seeing it wrong by 1, 2, 3. These are my recommendations. That is now how you educate. That is how you probe these issues.
Okay, so Bryan, should we have a targeted approach to gender-based violence, or should we interrogate more violence? Maybe we are a violent nation. So in that statement and the question I just asked, should we focus more on GBV? Can I interrogate the tata violence as a whole?
I think we need to interrogate violence as a whole, because now if we deal with the violence, gender-based issues would obviously decline. Yes, because we are going to deal with a person, or whether or not this person is a violent person, and how am I going to deal with the issue that is violent.
Okay, so before we wrap it up, right, I want to understand then what role does a complainant play in a criminal case, and as to whether I can withdraw before maybe the judge has made a ruling on the issue I've since brought to the court.
Yes, a complainant can assist the court by being a witness and providing the necessary evidence in the form of maybe whatever that the complainant will bring. Remember, the role of the state is to prosecute, remember earlier we had mentioned the presumption of innocence, to say this person is not innocent but is guilty, and to mount a case against the accused. So the complainant can come as a witness and assist the court in that regard. On the issue of withdrawals, yes, go nna le di-case tse e leng gore batho ba di withdraw. Normally the court would have an opportunity or would have the right to entertain it further. The problematic issue about it, yona evidence, because ha motho a withdraw o gana go nna mosupi. So bosupi bong yaano ba hokotsega. Remember, the threshold is a bit higher than in civil cases, beyond reasonable doubt.
Okay. So you don't just withdraw your case from the court. You have to maybe speak to the judge or show cause to the judge as to why you are withdrawing.
Well, you can. You are allowed to withdraw. Normally, it will be the state withdraw and the complainant haba to pursue. Agree, the responsibility of the state is to prosecute, but they prosecute but to get the complainant gore anne compliant ha go teng ne mosupi o ka re tisetsa bosupi bo bontseng ya mo gongwe ba bangwe ga ba withdraw o kgona go ska he bosupi ba eleng gore bo ka find someone guilty.
And maybe in a case where ra kgante no supa gone gore re tshwanetse go nna seoposeng when trying to deal with or fight this pandemic that is, GBV and violence. Can someone, a third party, can they launch a case on my behalf as a victim?
Yes, according to the Domestic Violence Act, someone can, even a parent can launch a case on a child's behalf.
And what would the third party need to demonstrate? What do they need?
Obviously, they would have to prove that the person himself is incapacitated to bring the application, or they have certain rights over the person. Maybe they are a legal guardian to say, I think this person is in danger, so I have the right to bring this application to remove him out of danger.
Yes. And maybe one last question would be, what in law, what recommendations can you make that would maybe be targeted to law changing or policy making? And in answering that, have a look at what makes it difficult to prosecute cases of violence committed domestically. I agree. Then you'd speak to what makes it difficult to prosecute. And then if at all it is an issue of law, where do you think a recommendation can come in?
Okay. Firstly, I will deal with maybe the problems that we have within the law insofar as prosecuting the same. The first issue would be to sometimes we spend so much as lawyers on the technicalities, not dealing with the actual meat or the merits of the matter. For example, if someone brings an application for restraint, you obtain a temporary order, but you have to serve the person you allege as a perpetrator, and the person is given an opportunity to file maybe an answering affidavit to say, but this person is lying, I haven't said that, I haven't provoked her, or I haven't stalked her, or I haven't done this and that. So I think one of the recommendations will be to find a way in which we can deal with the merits of the matter, not to entertain technicalities when we deal with these issues. The other recommendation will be to capacitate the courts, to have gender specialists in the courts, to say you have a judge or a magistrate that is specifically dealing with the issues of gender. Not just a judge who's going to adjudicate over a labor matter, over a trade matter, over this and that. So we should have specialized courts to that extent. Thirdly would be to have a law that represents the views of Botswana. So we need a study to say, do Botswana really want death penalty? To what extent? Then you have a law. Then you have a law that really represents the mind of an accused person. Gore motho wa mme ga commit a crime, o godile yang, o godisitswe yang, ebile re ka thusa jang. So that would go to psychological support of young children. That would go to grassroots advocacy through civic society organizations, through interviews like this, and through other mediums.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Bryan Ramaphane.
Thank you very, very much for the opportunity.
Yes, that was Mr. Bryan Ramaphane, whose work in pro bono does not go unnoticed. This marks the end of our dialogue. Thank you.